Have you ever had that moment where plans get canceled and instead of disappointment, you feel a strange sense of relief? Like your shoulders drop, your breathing slows, and a quiet voice inside you says, "Good, I needed this." While everyone else talks about how lonely that sounds, you're secretly excited about a night alone with your thoughts, your routines, your space. And at some point, you've probably wondered, is something wrong with me for preferring this? We live in a world that treats being alone like a problem that needs fixing. Silence is awkward. Canceling plans feels rude. Wanting solitude gets labeled as antisocial, shy, or even sad. But psychology tells a very different story, because preferring to be alone isn't about hating people. It's about how your mind processes the world. And once you understand what's really happening in your brain, that preference starts to look less like a flaw and more like a quiet kind of intelligence. Think about your mind like a room with a very sensitive sound system. Every conversation, every notification, every emotional exchange turns the volume up just a little. For some people, that noise feels energizing, like a party that fuels them. For others, especially people who prefer being alone, that same noise drains the system faster. Not because they're weak, but because their brains are wired to pick up more detail, more tone, more subtext, more emotional information. Psychologists often describe this as higher sensitivity to stimulation. Your brain doesn't just register what's being said, it notices how it's said. The pause before someone responds, the subtle shift in mood, the social undercurrents that most people glide past without thinking. Being around others isn't neutral input for you. It's rich, complex data, and data processing takes energy. So when you choose solitude, you're not running away from people. You're giving your mind the quiet it needs to reset. It's like closing a dozen browser tabs at once and finally letting the system cool down. Alone time isn't empty for you, it's restorative. There's also a common misunderstanding that people who prefer being alone are introverted in the stereotypical sense, shy, socially anxious, awkward. But plenty of people who love solitude are confident, articulate, and socially capable. They can walk into a room and hold a conversation just fine. They just don't want to do it all the time. Social ability and social preference are not the same thing. Some of the most self-assured people you'll ever meet are also the ones who need the most alone time, because solitude gives them something that constant interaction doesn't: clarity. When you're alone, you're not performing. You're not adjusting your tone. You're not filtering your thoughts to fit the moment. You get to hear your own internal voice without interference. And that internal voice matters to you more than most people realize. People who prefer being alone often have a strong inner world. Their thoughts aren't background noise. They're a place they actively inhabit. Ideas bounce around. Questions unfold. Emotions get examined instead of avoided. This is why boredom hits you differently. When you're alone, you're rarely bored in the traditional sense. Your mind always has something to chew on.
Historically, many thinkers, writers, scientists, and philosophers leaned heavily into solitude for this exact reason. Not because they disliked society, but because their best thinking happened away from it. Solitude allowed them to explore ideas without interruption, to let thoughts evolve slowly instead of being rushed by conversation. There's a reason so many breakthroughs happen in quiet moments, in the shower, on long walks, late at night when the world finally goes still. Another layer to this preference comes from emotional self-regulation. When you're alone, you don't have to manage other people's emotions. You don't have to mirror energy, reassure, entertain, or respond on demand. For people who are naturally empathetic, that constant emotional attunement can be exhausting. If you've ever left a social gathering feeling strangely tired, even though nothing bad happened, that's your nervous system telling you it's been working overtime. Solitude becomes a way to recalibrate, to return to emotional baseline. And here's something rarely talked about. People who prefer being alone often value depth over frequency in relationships. They don't need constant contact to feel connected. A few meaningful interactions can matter more than daily chatter. They're okay with long gaps between conversations because emotional bonds, for them, don't dissolve with silence. This can sometimes be misinterpreted by others as distance or disinterest, but internally, the connection is still there. It's just not dependent on continuous validation. There's also a strong link between solitude and autonomy. When you spend time alone, you become comfortable making decisions without external input. You learn to trust your own judgment. Your preferences become clearer because they're not constantly being negotiated with the group. This can make people who prefer being alone seem independent to the point of being mysterious. They don't follow trends just to belong. They don't feel the same pressure to conform socially, not because they're rebellious, but because their sense of self isn't anchored in constant feedback. Your identity feels more internally generated than externally reinforced. Of course, this doesn't mean preferring solitude comes without challenges. Living in a hyper-social culture can make you second-guess yourself. You might feel guilty for saying no to plans. You might wonder if you're missing out. You might even push yourself to socialize more than feels natural, just to meet expectations. And sometimes that creates a strange inner conflict. You crave connection, but on your own terms. You want closeness, but not constant presence. You want to be understood without having to explain why you disappear for a while. Psychologically, this tension often comes from the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a painful absence of connection. Solitude is a chosen state that feels nourishing. People who prefer being alone are usually very good at telling the difference, even if others aren't. You're not avoiding people because you feel empty. You're choosing quiet because you feel full. There's even neuroscience behind why solitude can feel so satisfying for certain people. Quiet environments allow the brain's default mode network to activate. This is the system involved in self-reflection, memory integration, creativity, and meaning-making. When external demands drop, your brain naturally turns inward. For some, that inward turn feels uncomfortable. For others, it feels like home.
And here's the twist. People who are comfortable alone often bring more presence into their relationships, not less. Because they're not desperate for interaction, they can choose it intentionally. They show up when they have energy, they listen deeply. They don't need to fill silence with noise. Their relationships may be fewer, but they tend to be richer. So if you've ever felt strange for enjoying your own company, it might be time to reframe the story you're telling yourself. Preferring being alone doesn't mean you're disconnected from humanity. It means you relate to it differently, from a quieter distance, from a place of observation, reflection, and depth. You don't need constant stimulation to feel alive. Your mind already has enough going on. And if this way of seeing the world makes sense to you, subscribe and follow the channel to explore these ideas more deeply. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. In a world that's always loud, always busy, always asking for more of your attention, choosing solitude can be a radical act of self-respect. It's you saying, I know how my mind works, and I'm honoring it. So the next time you find yourself happily alone while the rest of the world rushes around outside, don't rush to label it. Just notice how you feel. The calm, the clarity, the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where you are. If any of this felt uncomfortably accurate or strangely comforting, you're not alone in that either. Take a moment to reflect on how solitude shows up in your life. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden psychology behind everyday behaviors like this, you already know where to be.